and I want to really think today about what it means for us. Okay, so let me start by reading it again. It came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there, and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Okay, I'm going to stop there. All right. This event here on Mount Moriah, where Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, is for me one of the most intense stories in Scripture. God never does the same thing twice, but he often does similar things. He has patterns, he has ways he works. And the chances are that somewhere in your life, if it hasn't already happened, somewhere in your life, you'll have a Mount Moriah event. You'll have a Mount Moriah season in which God will ask you to do something. He'll ask you to take all, blanked out on his name. Anyway, one fellow who teaches, and some of you'll know who I'm talking about, says there's sometimes when God asks you to push all your chips to the center of the table and let everything ride on him, to risk absolutely everything for your faith. And he will call us to those moments. Abraham here was asked to give up, there were so many things about this. First of all, it didn't make any sense. And there'll be times when God brings you to a Mount Moriah time in your life where he's calling you to do something, to not do something, to go away that doesn't make any logical sense, to go against everything that seems rational. And you're going to have to just ask yourself, do I really believe? Or am I just going through the motions or just being a part of the Christian community? Or do I really believe? There are times when God will ask you to sacrifice the thing you care about more than anything else in the world, except for your walk with God. And you'll have to ask, do I care about my walk with God more? There are times when God will say, there's a lot of times where God calls us to give up the world, to give up the things that we've left behind for him. But there's times when God will seem to be asking you to give up the things he's given you, the things that came from him. Abraham here is being asked to give up the very son that his whole faith journey has been about. He's been for decades working through this question of, will God give me a son? Will God give me a son? And God has finally given it to him. And now God says, and now I want him back. And this is, there are times when we feel like God is saying, everything you've ever learned about from me, everything you've ever received from me, I'm going to ask for it back. There are times when he brings us to the very 11th hour and takes it beyond what he takes away every human hope for anything we could have had and said, I want you to trust me beyond that. And if you haven't had a Mount Moriah moment, it will probably happen at some point. But the Mount Moriah moment is not just a moment where we lose everything. It's a moment where we may feel like we're going to lose everything, but God provides. God came through. Abraham did not lose his son. He did not sacrifice Isaac. He did not have to kill Isaac. It came out that God had something bigger, something better than that. When we reach that 11th hour where we have absolutely nothing to go on and no hope, and then God comes through, it turns out that all the apparent sacrifice we made was really not a sacrifice at all in some ways. It was just the darkness before the dawn. So you may find that God will put you in a Moriah moment at times. So I want to talk about these Moriah moments in a lot of different ways. One of the teachers I follow a lot talks about the fact that faith is inherently a tension. There's always this tension as people who are still living in a fallen world and not yet in heaven, not yet with the Lord. We're living in this tension between what we believe and what we see. Faith brings up this tension between the promises, the things we think must be true, and the things that seem to be the reality around us. And we have to sort of live in that uncomfortableness. We have to live in that place where we haven't seen it be resolved yet, but we're still hoping for it. And there's two ways to get out of the tension. One is to become fatalistic and to just give up and say, well, I'm going to stop believing you then. I'm just going to give up and just accept whatever you give me. And oh well. And that's not quite faith. That's just fatalism. That's just giving up. And the other way to try to get out of faith, try to get out of the tension of faith, is to just start claiming things. I just refuse to accept this. It's got to be such and such a way. That's not faith either. Faith puts us in the middle and makes us wait. It makes us keep trusting and still, even while we still don't see it. And so God's wanting to develop your faith. He's wanting to develop my faith. He's wanting to teach us to trust him even when we don't see the answer yet, even when we're going by faith and not by sight. And he wants to clear out the idols. He wants to take everything that might be raised up against him, more important to us than him. And even those things that come from him, he wants them not to become idols. He wants us to be able to give them up if that's what it came to. Sometimes this means even our own ministry, our own service to him. You may go through a Mount Moriah moment where God says, I want you to give up everything you've been doing for me. I want you to be willing to see it all go away if that's what I would call you to. And it doesn't make any sense. And we have to still just trust him. There's two important New Testament passages that talk about this moment. I want to take a look at both of them. One is James 2. Which says this. James says in verse 18, someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works. I'll show you my faith by my works. So he's saying we are saved by faith, but that faith should have works. That faith should turn into something. It should show itself in action. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Faith is what saves us, but the faith we need is a faith that will turn into works, a faith that will show itself in works. And then he uses the example of Abraham. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? Now, what does he mean? Because Romans says very clearly he was justified by faith. Well, what he means is the works showed his faith. You see that faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was perfected or completed or brought to its fullest. Abraham's faith really was shown to be faith in Genesis 22. He believed God way back in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, but his faith was really shown to be faith in Genesis 22. Abraham's faith was not a bunch of different faiths. It was one faith, which started sort of weak and grew and grew and grew over time. And then Isaac was born, and then it grew and grew over time. And then he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. And this really demonstrates the work that God had done in Abraham to bring him from a man of just a little bit of faith to a lot of faith. Our faith is something that when we get saved, that's just the beginning of it. That same saving faith that you have when you get saved, that's enough to save you. Or God is who saves you, but it's enough. God counts it as enough to save you. He counts it as righteousness. But then he still continues to grow that faith and to perfect it and to make it more. Here's a verse in 1 Peter that you may remember. He says, You're protected, verse 5, you're protected by the power of God through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. You already are saved. You're already protected. Your faith is already there protecting you. But there's a growth. There's a process here. In this, you greatly rejoice. In the salvation you know is coming, you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable. He means the faith is more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. He says, your faith is more valuable than gold. Even gold is tested by fire, but it's extremely valuable. Your faith, not as perishable as gold, your faith, which is everlasting and never going to perish, and is just going to grow and grow and grow, is being tested by fire to bring great honor and glory to Jesus. And that's the same faith you started with. It's just grown. So there's this picture of our faith, which grows just like Abraham's faith grew until he reached the Mount Moriah moment. And we will have Mount Moriah moments in our lives, which are simply God taking us one step further in our journey of faith, in our journey of what it means to trust Christ with everything. There's another passage, though, that talks about this event, and that's in Hebrews. Is just finished saying in Hebrews 11, back in verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, and so on. And then in verse 17, it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. What he's saying is, Abraham is a picture of Jesus here, or of the Father, but of both. He's sort of a picture of both. God offered up his only son to save us. And God comes to Isaac and says, offer up your only son. But it says, he considered that God is able to raise people from the dead. He knew that it said, from Isaac, your descendants will be called. He's thinking, how can God ask me to kill Isaac? It doesn't make any sense. And then he must have just said, I don't know how this can possibly work out, but God must be going to somehow give him back to me even from the dead. I don't know what's going on, but that must be what's happening. And he did this in faith, but it was a painful thing. It was still a sacrifice. It was still a risk. It was still an incredible leap for him to trust everything to God. And then it says this is a picture of Jesus then, that he got his son back from the dead, just as a type, as a picture, as a foreshadowing of Jesus who would be sacrificed for us and then would come back from the dead. Let's see, what else do I want to mention? Let's look at the example of Job. Job is not about people resurrecting, but Job is a great example of somebody who was willing to believe even when God seemed to take back from him everything that he'd given him. So Job had all these blessings, partly because he was following God so closely. And then you know the story about how Satan wanted to test him. He said, if you curse Job, then he will curse you. And God says, you may try that. And so I want you to show you the two responses. Now, Job struggled later in the book, but the main picture of Job is that he was more righteous than his friends were. And the first two chapters have a very strong picture of how righteously he responded. The first thing that happened was, it says in verse 20, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So Job was clear on the difference between the gifts that God gives and God himself. And he was like, if he was saying to himself and saying to God, saying to people, God is the one who's given and blessed me in so many ways. God can take that away if he chooses. He's still God. He's still worth worshiping. He's still blessed. And I'm not going to blame him. He can take away what he chooses, and he can give what he chooses. This is the picture of what sometimes we're asked to do in our Mount Moriah moments, to say, God, I will trust you more even than I trust what you've given me. I will look to you more even than what I've given me. And then in verse 9, in the next chapter, his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This was the right response. And he was saying, Look, it's God who gives it. I accepted these good things not just because they were good, but because they came from him. And if he now gives me something that doesn't make any sense, if he now gives me adversity and suffering and trials, it still comes from God. And I just want whatever God gives. Not meaning want that he was happy about this. Of course, he was in great suffering, but he was saying we need to accept whatever God gives. And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So this is Job's Moriah moment. Was this this Moriah event, not just a moment, by the way. It took 3 days for Abraham to journey with Isaac to that mountain. Those 3 days, every single step must have been so painful and must have been so intense. But for 3 days, he got to let this sit with him and sink in. Am I really going to follow God in this? Am I really going to trust God with this? Am I really going to put everything on the altar for him? Not just Isaac, but all my hopes and dreams with him. Of course, but Isaac is the pinnacle of that. Let's see. What else do I want to mention? It's really interesting how much this puts Abraham at the center. When a Mount Moriah moment comes, we're often called not to be passive, but to take action. Abraham had to journey. Abraham had to bind his son on the altar. Abraham had to lift his hand to take the knife. And when God takes us to these Mount Moriah moments, he sometimes calls us into a time of crisis where we have to take action and choose to act. And remember, he says that now that I know that you will not withhold things. There's a sense in which God knew everything from the beginning because he's omniscient, but there's a sense in which he needed for Abraham to make this decision. Abraham, it all came down to his own choice at a certain point. It all came down to something that he could say yes or no to. And there's something about the crisis of Mount Moriah moment in which it's like the whole universe fades and it is you and your choice, you and God. And you have to make the decision. What will I do? How will I respond? How will I act? And nobody else can really understand that. A Mount Moriah moment is very lonely. Abraham didn't go and consult his wife or a whole bunch of other people. He didn't tell anybody what was going on, not even Isaac. He just went and thought about it on his own for 3 days as he and Isaac walked there with those two servants. But he didn't discuss it with them, and they obviously didn't know what was happening when he got to the mountain. So there's these moments, at these Mount Moriah moments, it will be just you and God. And nobody else will necessarily understand the thing you're being asked to do. Nobody else will understand how much of a sacrifice it is for you. Perhaps nobody else will be able to understand the depth of the test that's being given to you. But God will be there with you, and I'm going to talk about that later. Jesus goes before you, and you will have to just rely on God. And so there's these times in our lives when it's just me and God and nobody else. And maybe other people around, but I'm not even aware of them. It's just me and God. And that's one of the things that happens in a Mount Moriah time. I want to show you a different example that is not something you would normally think of. I want to think about the example of Peter when he denied Jesus. I want to take you to Luke. Hold on. Peter was convinced that he was not going to deny God. He was not going to deny Jesus. Peter had made lots of foolish mistakes. He jumped in without thinking all the time. But the one thing I'm sure he was confident in is that he was courageous. The one thing I'm sure he was confident in is that he was the one who was always out in front. And Jesus says, some of you are going to deny me. And Peter's thinking, not me. That's the one thing I'm sure of. As foolish as I've been, as stupidly as I respond in faith. And Jesus says, no, you're going to fail. At the area of which, in the one area that you're proudest of, in the one area that you're surest of, you're going to fail. And he says in verse 31, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. How was he going to sift Peter? He was going to grind him up in his own moral failure. But I prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Now, my first thought when I read this is, how did Peter's faith not fail? He was hit with this moment of, do you deny Jesus or courageously confess him? And he did deny Jesus. His faith did not fail. But that's not what Jesus means. He means, after you've failed, after you've denied me, then that your faith may not fail. Then that you won't go off like Judas and commit suicide, but you'll let me come back and bring you back. And you, he says, once you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. And Peter still says, no, I'm ready to go both to prison and to death. And he says, I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you've denied 3 times that you know me. So for Simon, the Moriah moment was not the moment when he denied Jesus. It was the moment after that. It was the 3 days that went from the denial of Jesus, the 2 or 3 days that went from the denial of Jesus to his meeting Jesus again after his resurrection. When what had happened was his faith had crumbled. His example of being a Christian, of being a disciple, had crumbled. He had lost every shred of self-righteousness he once perhaps had. He'd lost every sense of himself as a good follower of Jesus that he perhaps once had because he had failed at the most critical moment. And that was his moment. Are you willing to just come to me needing forgiveness, needing pardon, and not being able to bring anything of your own energy, your own faith, your own courage, just saying, God, I am just helpless. I just need your pardon. And that was his Moriah moment, was being willing to accept his failure. And some of you, that may be your Moriah moment. God may bring you to a place where all the remaining bits of your self-righteousness have to crumble, where the things you thought were your unique ministry, your unique gifting may seem to fall apart, where the things you had given yourself to, you now have decided you're just a failure. And God's doing that not because he's wanting to bring failure into your life, but because he wants to know, are you willing to put me above everything, even above your own service for me? Peter's response, the response of faith that Peter needed to make, wasn't the response he thought it was, I'm going to never deny you. But the response was, once I failed, am I willing to come back to you and just admit that I need you? The rich young ruler, we misunderstand that sometimes. The rich young ruler was told what he had to do to gain eternal life. He had to leave everything and follow Jesus. And he walked away sadly. And I used to think the end of the story that should have happened is that he should have turned back and said, wait a minute, I give everything to you, Jesus. But Jesus talks about it with his disciples and said, with man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. The ending of the story that should have happened for the rich young ruler is that he should have turned around and said, Jesus, I cannot do this. I am so unrighteous. I can't put away this idol for God. Help me. Help me repent, help me surrender, help me have the faith that I need to have. And then he would have been where Jesus needed him to be. Not where he says, look at this bold sacrifice I'm making for you, but where he said, I've discovered that I don't have it in me to act the way that I should. I need your forgiveness. I need your help. I need your salvation. And that's sometimes what the Mount Moriah moments we encounter are designed to teach us, is how much we cannot do it on our own. But the sacrifice that comes, the sacrifice on Moriah, is not a test of obedience primarily. It's a test of faith. It's, again, cleansing every idol. The point is not sacrifice. The point is faith. In the long run, God took away that sacrifice. He didn't have to make it. But what he did have to do is decide, do I believe God? Do I believe that he's powerful enough? And do I believe that he's good enough? And for us, for you, your Mount Moriah moment, your Mount Moriah season very much may be asking you, do you believe that I'm good? That God asks you, do you believe that I'm good? Do you believe in my goodness to you? Do you believe that I am worth it? Do you believe that if you give everything to me, you will not in the long run lose out? And I want to show you at the end of this, the one more example that's really important for us. And that's the example of Jesus. So I want you to think about Jesus, whose Mount Moriah event was the cross. You see the beginning of this way back in the wilderness, when he went to be tempted by the devil in the wilderness. And Satan 3 times says, here, you can have this because of who you are. You can turn these stones into bread. You can throw yourself down from the temple and have me raise you up in a spectacular miracle. You can have all the kingdoms of the world to fulfill your ministry. And Jesus had to say, no, it is worth more. Before I even begin, I am giving up all those things that I might seek to gain from my own power and ministry. And instead, I'm following my Father. I'm worshiping God and God alone. And it says then Jesus retreated Satan retreated until a more opportune time. And we see the opportune time as we get to Gethsemane. I want to start by going to a verse in John. Jesus said in verse 23, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What he means is crucified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And he's talking about them, but he's also talking about himself. He's thinking, I'm about to fall into the earth and die. And that's the only way I can bear much fruit. He who loves his life loses it. And he who hates his life in this world will keep it to life eternal. And then he tells them, this is the same thing for you. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. He means, I'm going into death. You're going to have to head into the suffering and death as well. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now my soul has become troubled. I think sometimes we get the picture that because Jesus was God, he just sort of sailed through the crucifixion with no pain, no suffering. We forget Gethsemane. But he suffered, he was troubled. He experienced all the human distress that we would experience ourselves if we were heading toward crucifixion and knew it was coming. What shall I say? He says, Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. He says, so much of me wants to pray, God, take me out of this. But that doesn't make any sense. That's the whole reason I came, is to go through what I'm about to go through. Father, glorify your name. And then we see that again in Gethsemane, which I'm not going to turn to. You know the story. He was praying in Gethsemane and he prayed, Father, if it possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thine be done. And he tells his disciples, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And he's prayed with great fervency and great intensity that God would help him get through what he was, either spare him from it or help him get through what he was about to face. I think Jesus humanly, when he went to the cross, was taking a huge step of faith. He was taking a huge risk in a sense, and you not truly, but it seemed like it. You can see that in Hebrews. It says, Hebrews 7:7, it says, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. It's talking about Gethsemane. And he was heard because of his piety. He's saying Jesus prayed from a human perspective. He prayed and asked, and God answered him with the resurrection. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Now, what does it mean that Jesus learned obedience? It wasn't that he was disobedient before. It's that as the second person of the Trinity in heaven, he never had to obey because he was reigning with the Father and the Spirit as God, as sovereign. There was no need to obey. But when he became human and took on a human form and then suffered for us, he had to learn obedience in that sense. And he had to suffer in that sense. Think about it. Without the crucifixion, without the incarnation and the crucifixion, God would never have experienced suffering. But God created a universe in which he knew he would suffer, as long as that's what it took to show his love to us, because that was better for him than a universe in which neither happened. So Jesus suffered and died and had to trust his Father to raise him from the dead. And then it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, not meaning that he had any flaws, but meaning he was made complete in his sacrifice. He became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, having become our high priest. And in Hebrews 2, it says something similar about Jesus. It says, verse 10, it was fitting for him, from whom are all things and through whom are all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to perfect or complete or bring to completion the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he's not ashamed to call them brethren. He called out in his Moriah moment to God, so that we would have hope in our Moriah moments to call out to God. And in Luke 9, you all know this passage, but you like it. We already saw something like this in John. He says, I'm going to the cross, but you're going to have to go to the cross in a sense if you follow me. Luke 9:23, he was saying to them all, well, actually, let's back up. Verse 22, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake, he's the one who'll save it. And so what he's saying is, my path here on earth is to go to suffer and die and then be raised. If you want to follow me, you may not be crucified, but you're going to be called to give up everything you thought you were keeping and to deny yourself, take up your cross, go the same path I'm doing. But you'll also have the same and the same outcome that I'm going to have. God will raise you up. He will reward you. You'll save your life, but you may have to lose it first. And there's a passage in First Peter which brings out the same idea. Peter talks about verse 20, or actually verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but to those who are unreasonable. And verse 19 is talking now just not to servants, but to everybody. This finds favor if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it. This finds favor with God. And then he says this, for you've been called for this purpose. What purpose? To suffer for others, to suffer in your ministry to others, your demonstration of who God is, who Christ is. Since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. He never sinned, even in his suffering. While being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats. He kept entrusting himself to whom it judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross for us. And it's not saying that you suffer to save other people from their sins, but in the same way as he showed such love to go and suffer for us and not sin, but keep just suffering righteously. So we are called to that kind of life, that kind of ministry. Now, this is not talking again about just suffering for suffering's sake. It's not talking about being one of the penitentes and flogging yourself to show your righteousness before God. It's talking about loving God and loving others and being willing to do whatever we can to show Christ to them. And he says, because of the world you live in, when you do that, it will be hard. You'll suffer persecution. You'll suffer loss. But those things are worth doing. And Jesus is our example. He goes before us. And I want to draw all that into this verse in Philippians 3. He says, this is my goal. Verse 8, more than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I've suffered the loss of all things and count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Christ. That's everything I'm going for. Not my own self-righteousness, says Paul, but Christ, that I may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness of God which comes on the basis of faith. And verse 10, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. He doesn't say the fellowship of our sufferings, but the fellowship of his sufferings. He says, as I serve Christ, and I'm put in prison for my serving Christ, and I'm caused to suffer in different ways, I just know that's a way of drawing closer to Jesus. It's a way of sharing in his sufferings, sharing in his love, sharing in his self-sacrificial giving to other people, being more and more like him in his death, and in order that I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. And then he says, I press on for that. So what he presses on for is his life becoming more and more a pure sacrifice of love for other people, not sacrifice for its own sake, but sacrifice for the sake of love, as Jesus's was. And he says, when I do that, I'm getting to know Jesus better. When I do that, I'm getting to know Jesus better. So the idea I wanted to get at here is that in our Mount Moriah moments, Jesus has already gone ahead of us. Jesus has already had his own Mount Moriah. It was Gethsemane. And Jesus has been there already, and he has already suffered it, and he's already gone through it and had the faith and learned the obedience and been raised from the dead. And he's gone ahead of us, and he says, I know what you're facing. So I said earlier, it's a very lonely thing. We stand alone before God, but we don't stand alone before God, really, because we stand there with Jesus, who has gone ahead of us. And whatever Mount Moriah moment you may be facing or you may one day face, Jesus has gone ahead of you. He has walked the path in front before you, and he knows what is going on. He knows what's happening. He's like Simon. He's prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you are drawing near to him and having fellowship with him, and you'll understand him at a deeper level. My wife and I have talked about the fact that across the many, many years that we've lived so far as Christians, we've noticed that there are some Christians who, after they've been believers about 40 years, it seems like people who faithfully serve God for decades and decades. If you talk to them in private when they're willing to just share whatever, they will talk about some place in their lives, some moment in their lives, some issue in their lives that just became the thing. And it defeated them. And it took them beyond anything they understood. It took them beyond anything that made any sense. And they learned that God was faithful even there. They learned that God was able to handle even that. And so whatever suffering they've gone through or whatever personal failure they've gone through, they have learned a brokenness and a humility and an absolute trust in God, which I'm sure is still growing and developing. but they've learned that, and there's something about that makes everything they do, everything they say, so much more meaningful. One writer talks about the woman who broke the vial of perfume, and then the fragrance filled the house. And he says, when you meet somebody who's been broken before God, there's something about them that just is a perfume, is an aroma that draws people to God, and you don't know why. You know they're drawing them. It's drawing others to them. And so I would like to challenge you, if you're in your Mount Moriah moment or in your Mount Moriah season, maybe nobody else understands, but Jesus understands, and he goes before you, and God is worth it. And he can do things even if they seem absolutely impossible. And even if they seem to go against everything that you know about him, he will turn out to have been a good God and a powerful God and a wise God, and to have done it all in a way that when you look back on it, you'll say, what an amazing God I have. And so I pray that you will be able to cling to him, look to him, let Jesus lead you through it. And that's it. Thank you.